Welcome to the followers of the Sfera Network YouTube channel. My name is Gail Rego, and I'm a social justice activist and the host of Europe Talks Back, a Sfera Network podcast. The Sfera Network is the first network of independent media in Europe. Europe Talks Back is usually an audio-only show. However, in the lineup to the EU elections, we've produced a couple of special video episodes as well. Today we'll be speaking with Kahina Rabahi and Bibi Abruzuni. Kahina represents the European Anti-Poverty Network and Bibi represents Forus, a network of civil society organizations. The discussion today will be about the role of the EU elections in ensuring our digital rights. Let's now jump into the discussion, and do share your thoughts in the comments below. Kahina, Bibi, so nice to have you. Thank you for joining us. Could we start with an introduction of both of you, please?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Kahina. I am the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the European Anti-Poverty Network. It's an umbrella organization that gathers more than 2,000 organizations in Europe fighting against poverty and social exclusion.
Thanks, Kahina.
Yeah. And I'm Bibi, so I'm the Communications Coordinator at Forus, which is a global civil society network. So, like Kahina, I guess we're also a member-based organization, and we have around 22,000 members around the world in over 124 countries. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's hope that all of your members hear this episode. It'll be we'll have a lot of listeners.
Oh, yeah.
So today we'll be talking about digitalization, as you know, especially with relation to the upcoming EU election. So let's start by setting a bit of context. What are we talking about when we talk about digitalization, especially in relation to human rights?
In our field, so digitalization refers to the use of digital tools to provide and get access to social services, essential services, and social protection, social benefits, and everything, and any services and scheme that helps you provide for a life, including employment. But when we talk about digitalization, we need to also make sure that digitalization is not something that just came out of nowhere. It's a tool. It's been out there for a very, very long time. And so even though now we are talking about this because regular people are more and more asked to engage in the digital space, the services themselves have been digitalized for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in our field, we also obviously talk about services, access to these services, but we especially focus on civic space. So basically how the digital sphere and how our digital rights are currently being affected, and how our civic space, so our right to protest, our right to express ourselves freely, is being shaped and transformed by the use of technologies, also emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, but not only. And at the same time, we also look at how we can participate to the democratic process through digitalization. Is that accessible to everybody? Is that something that we should be? Is it an opportunity or is it a risk? And I think that when we look, for example, at the European elections and the upcoming European elections, the digital space plays a key role, because we have to be sure that that space is safe, is accessible, and it's not sort of a platform to spread misinformation, to spread disinformation, to manipulate information, and where citizens, communities, as a result of their active engagement in these platforms, are victims of cyberbullying, harassment, etc., etc., etc.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact or consequences of this digitalization on people, especially the communities that you're here representing. Could you give us some examples of how different countries in the EU have been using this technology for social benefits and protections, and in what ways this has been harming people?
Mm-hmm. So the first myth that one has to debunk is the idea that digitalization is increasing coverage. That's not true, because how digitalization is implemented is actually increasing the cost for the most people, the poorest, to get access to those schemes and benefits and services. When I say that, I mean that now, in order to take appointment or in order to fill your application for benefits, you have to do it online. If you do not have access to internet, if you do not have access to equipment, you will have to pay now to get your application processed. So this is what we at EAPN start calling digitally induced poverty, which means that in order to get access to schemes that are supposed to be there to lift you out of poverty, you have to pay for them, and actually pay a great cost to get to them. It means you will have to travel a longer... because digitalization also means that offices are closing now. If you can't do it online, you have to travel longer distance to get to an office. So that's the first barrier, because digitalization do not challenge the root causes of exclusion and poverty. It becomes then another barrier to those communities to get access to the benefits. It's also not user friendly. The language used is very complex and difficult. And the process, because it's not user-friendly, that's my second point, is very error-prone. So the fact that you have to do it online, I don't know if you ever had to apply for anything online, any administration, you understand that it's extremely complicated. Doing your taxes online is complicated. Applying for social benefits is complicated, and so on and so forth. And so you're more prone to error. And so what we see on top of everything that I described is that you have more and more software implemented to detect error and to punish error. So that, when I say punish, I mean that in some countries, for instance, in Netherlands, in France, certain groups were predominantly targeted by AI to look at how, they use AI to score some groups, women, migrants, racialized communities by proxy, unemployed people, and so on and so forth. So based on protected characteristics. So they use that, and those groups were more severe by the system. And so, of course, because you're more severe, the rate of error is increased. And so you have to pay back, you have to go through indebtment procedure, overpayment procedure, and even at the end of the day, you pay back the money, you will still have this red card on your file, on your identity in the future. So this is how the process is done. It makes it more complicated, deterrence. It has a deterrent effect. Even if you jump through the hoops and finally get to an application, then the process is not done with you, because the end goal is to detect fraud and errors and not make sure that you have access to your protection.
Yeah, exactly. So like Kahina was saying, it does have tremendous impacts on the life of citizens and communities. And besides also the aspect of access, there is also this aspect that I think you also sort of touched upon in a subtle way, of the capacity and the education element of digitalization. So we're basically expected to be able automatically, as if by divine talent, to use the software, the hardware. And I do remember my grandmother, she's 95 years old, and she uses WhatsApp, and for the family she's a genius because for most old people, for example, or older people in Italy, I mean, they have no idea even how to turn on perhaps the computer. So as Kahina was saying, when we talk about e-health, well, what e-health are we actually talking about? It does have all these type of repercussions. And I think also when we talk about the work of civil society organizations, right? Obviously, we have to integrate the digital aspect in our work, digital advocacy, digital technologies to support communities that we serve. However, even though there is the willingness to use digital technologies for the benefit of the communities, we just somehow sometimes don't have the know-how to do that. And the schemes that support the citizens in capacity strengthening, capacity development are too few at the moment. So there needs to be some funding that goes as well into that to support, for example, civil society organizations to use these technologies safely, or to support people like my grandmother in the mountains in Italy to apply, for her doctor appointments online. So yeah, just to add to what Kahina was saying.
Let's talk a little bit about the unseen or more invisible power dynamics behind this digitalization. Who gets to decide what technology is created, for what purpose, and against which groups or communities? What was your experience on that?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question that you're asking, and this is definitely a priority for the Forest Network, which is to think and unpack the power dynamics behind digitalization. Basically, a lot of research shows that internet governance fora are extremely difficult to access for civil society in the so-called global majority. So most of the organizations that are going to be part of these fora are going to be from the so-called global north or global minority. Not only this, it's already a miracle if civil society is meaningfully engaged in these decision-making spaces. And when we look at how this affects digitalization, I think that it's quite clear because, as you were saying, like we cannot take digitalization and just put it in a box. Like it's part of this huge ecosystem of rights, of social dynamics, of social structures, of inequalities, and we see that so many communities are just not part of this conversation, and basically almost everybody is excluded from this conversation because it just happens behind closed doors, and then maybe a legislation comes out, but we don't have much of a say. So when we talk about power and we talk about power shift, which is actually a movement that originates from the global majority to say we need to be part of these conversations, we need to be funded as well to be able to be part of this conversation. And there are things that are often not even taken into consideration. For example, now we will have the Internet Governance Fora happening in Saudi Arabia. Already a lot of civil society organizations responded to that. Besides the politics behind where the Internet Governance Forum will happen, there is just the logistics. So who is going to be getting a visa to travel to Riyadh and be part of this conference? Who is going to be getting a visa to travel to Geneva next month for the AI for Good conference? I mean, it's really about how the world is structured and all the inherent discrimination, inherent inequalities, inherent challenges that communities who might not be from very privileged backgrounds face. So definitely power is a huge part of this conversation about digitalization.
Why do you think, and I know I'm asking you to guess intentions again here, but why do you think policymakers are basically not inviting or providing this access towards communities affected, towards civil society? And what do you think we can do to push politicians and make them more accountable to provide this access?
The goal is not to, because they're not invited because the goal is not to cater to them. That's why. And so if we come from these places where we want to be invited to engage or to discuss in a system or a structure that is not here to protect you or to cater to your need, then what's the point? Being invited to decide whether or not we use digitalization or whether or not what kind of digital tools we are going to use for those for those schemes or for this needs. That means that we need to assess the need of the communities, and that has not been done. And so that's why we're not invited, because the goal is to, like I said, efficiency. And also another goal that that we need to take into account is that state and even the EU, the administration of the EU, is not able to develop those tools. Is not able, do not have the infrastructure to create those AI software. So they have to rely on private sector. And so they are invited to the table because they are part of this of this mission, of this goal. There is a lack of accountability on private sector, what kind of enterprises and company are invited, for what, how much they are paid, what is the transparency related to the contract, and so on and so forth. But they are invited because they are here to promote this larger system of profit. And so the state is profiting for that because they are surveilling more people, more communities. So private sector is benefiting from that because they are paid to develop those tools and they are making a lot of profit from that. But we will not be invited to the table because the goal is not to serve us. That's the only reason why I understand that we are not invited. Another thing that needs to be understood is that even though you put your application online, does not mean necessarily that an AI software will go through your application. And so that also means that if the AI is used for your application, you do not know. And so there is a lack of information to what extent, how much digitalization is used throughout the process of your application. Because you could expect that, okay, you apply online, but at the end of the day, it's the human being that process the information that you put and maybe follow up with an interview. That's you don't know when you apply. And so there is a lack of transparency, of accountability. And so I think we need to first understand what is the goal in order to... I don't want to be invited to a table where my needs are not discussed. That's what I want to say.
So the EU likes to market itself, let's say, as a pioneer of human rights, and it's also being heralded as, one of the leading or one of the first kind of groups or countries or environments that has put together or put forward digital legislation. So I wanted to ask you, relatively recently, we've had the AI Act and the Digital Services Act. So just to get an idea of, without going into the technical details, what are these policies doing well in terms of progressing human rights, and where is it lacking, or where does it kind of stop in terms of, as you were talking about, enabling companies to profit more, but taking away social benefits or rights from people?
Where to start? Perhaps we can briefly touch upon the AI Act. So as a network, just before the AI Act, sort of the trialogue reached its climax, we decided to work together on a project which is called the Civil Society Manifesto for Ethical AI. And in doing so, we did reach out to plenty of partners, plenty of civil society organizations from all over the world to listen to their thoughts, visions, and experiences with AI. And well, what came out of this sort of collective experiment, it's more of a storytelling experiment than a document filled with recommendations, is that everybody has both, of course, hopes, but especially fears when it comes to AI in practice. And of course, when the negotiations were happening, civil society coalitions really sort of try to list all their recommendations, about defending rights, tackling discrimination, etc., etc. But unfortunately, you could see it if you were here in Brussels. The lobby that happened from the private sector in particular around the act made the negotiations almost impossible. I mean, there was a point in which people were like, is this thing even going to happen, or is this just going to be sort of like extinguished by all the pressures, especially from the private sectors that were happening? And you could literally feel it if you were walking around Brussels in those days, where things were being so-called decided. There was this tension in the air, sort of like, who is making the decisions here and for what? And this is also what you were talking about, this tension between the rights and the growth, the benefits, the richness, the competitiveness. It's a difficult word for me to say, but how competitive the EU is in the digital race. So every legislation is going to be affected by that, because when you think in those terms, you think that, well, digitalization is a global dimension. What is going to happen to the EU if we are, of course, as always, we hear surpassed, in this digital race by China, by the US, or by other political structures as well. So there was the environment in which these negotiations took place, which were kind of eye-opening for many civil society organizations. And then, of course, what came out of it, with a big interrogation and actually exclamation point on everything about cyber surveillance, facial recognition, and the impacts that will have on activists, civil society, citizens who are just wanting to go out in the street and, express their opinions. What is going to happen to them? Right? It will depend upon the government who is in power, because one government will say, well, nothing will happen to you. This is your right. This is your democratic freedom. Great. But things, we have seen how things change, and also quite quickly. We have seen it all over the world. We have seen it in Brazil, with Bolsonaro. We have seen it in the US with the Trump administration. I mean, there is so much that we take now for granted, but that could be swept away like a carpet from under our feet. So this is the problem then, when the legislation doesn't do its best to protect all your rights. The legislation has to think about the worst case scenario. That is what it's there for. It's not there if everything goes well, everybody's safe. Well, why would we even need a legislation, right? Legislations are there to make sure that it's written in capital letters that your rights are being defended. And is this going to be happening with the AI Act and with any type of legislation regarding digitalization? Yeah. We're not 100% confident.
Okay, so we talked, I mean, thank you very much for providing all of that context around where we are, the narrative around it, what the EU is doing, who has the power and who is being invited to the table. And we've talked a lot about how technology could be used positively, but unfortunately is being used in many ways to further marginalize and further limit access to services, to social services. I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about how technology is also affecting us, I would say, at a quite elemental democratic level, by which I mean that people are now more and more afraid of how AI facial technology is being used to track, surveil, monitor activists, protesters, and how this ultimately has a huge impact on the functioning of a democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely now we cannot just talk about civic space, we also talk about a digital civic space. So everything that happens online that touches upon our collective and individual freedoms. So this is definitely the right to express yourself. We have interviewed activists in various countries who have been hacked and whose social media accounts were taken over because of their social justice or environmental justice efforts. We have also definitely heard about activists and civil society organizations being tracked, followed, surveilled, because of their activities and because of also the type of communications that they were sharing online. So definitely you don't feel safe, you don't feel legitimate in this sort of environment. And we also see a further trend, and this is why, as far as, for example, we are part of the Keep It On coalition by Access Now. They do great work in this field, and is to prevent internet shutdowns when in tense political environments and periods, and especially this year they're doing a big campaign on elections. So billions basically of people will be voting this year, and of course the EU, but we have India, we have South Africa, we have the US as well. So 2024 has been dubbed the buzzword, the election year, and as a result the risks of internet shutdowns and of basically using the digital sphere, the access or non-access of the digital sphere as a weapon is very high. And on top of that, there is also this aspect of digitalization in conflict regions and conflict areas. And we have seen that once again, it's not anymore about what just happens in the territory itself, but also about the cyber warfares and how digitalization is used in very, very vulnerable places where there are humanitarian, crises. We have seen it in Sudan, for example, where digitalization and internet shutdowns are constantly being used to disrupt even more communities. So definitely there is this aspect of how digitalization is affecting our rights to engage in democracy, and also this very just to finish this sort of concept, this fact that okay, we're going to go and vote, and we are being asked to play a very important role as citizens, right? To cast our vote. This will have repercussions for the next 4 years or for the next mandate, right? But at the same time, as citizens, we are becoming a bit worried and scared about our right to protest and our right to make makers accountable, both in the digital space, we see that increasingly more, and also just in our streets. So this is sort of the paradox of our days.
So my last question to you, just so we end on a slightly more hopeful note, is also just to look at how we can learn from each other, or what are some alternative solutions to move towards a better narrative and in the end to move for better social justice. How can and how should we learn from each other, whether that's cross-sector or from the global majority? What are some positive examples and solutions that we're seeing that we can reciprocate or we can duplicate in Europe?
I think the positive examples are amplified by digitalization, but they were already existing before digitalization. And by that, I mean, the first example that comes to mind is when in 2014 there were the uprising in Ferguson and St. Louis, if I remember correctly, happening at the same time as the bombardment and the war and the uprising in Palestine. And it was interesting to see that not only there were there were mutual solidarity between those two oppressed groups and communities, but also they were exchanging recipes to face tear gas, and how what can you use, like what kind of milk you should use to recover from tear gas and so on and so forth. So that was very uplifting, like to see that through social media, through different means of communication, there were concrete acts of solidarity and closeness between oppressed group, and we see that happening even now with the genocide going on in Gaza. That there is the same kind of, okay, how can we learn from each other, from the protest in the U.S., in France, and in Belgium, and how do we uplift and amplify the voices of survivors in Palestine. And I think that this comes from a long line of solidarity between students, between some groups, oppressed groups in the north, with the same oppressed group in the global majority, and colonized countries. And I see that digitalization can amplify that. Digitalization also, I think it was interesting, one of your previous questions, because I was reflecting, and it was interesting to see that because digitalization is another tool used against the poor, it forces organizations working on poverty and social rights to discuss digitalization. And so that forces us to develop expertise on digitalization, where before we kind of seen it as peripheral issue, something that we don't is not the core of a problem. Now it's so transversal, and it affects so many points and areas of life that you have to develop an expertise, but also you need to develop services that provide for the communities. And so you see that more and more organizations that works on poverty are opening office hours to support you in your application process and so on. So that also help those organizations to become closer with the community that they serve. So that's a positive example. But I think it's a positive example because they hijack the very purpose of digitalization. It goes against the purpose of what the creator of those tools have, because Google doesn't care about your applications procedure, Amazon doesn't care, Facebook, all of that, they do not care. But that's why it's a hijack of those tools to kind of counteract the effect. And I think that this is also this legacy of this heritage of hijacking the master tools to serve you should be taken with pinch of salt, because it's still the master tools, and it won't liberate you. So that's why it's it has to be you need this balance between overconfidence on the digitalization and this whole idea that social media brings us together, because as you mentioned, there is cyberbullying, there is backlash, accounts are blocked and so on, and shadow banning and so on. But at the same time, it has the potential to get us to another place where we meet offline and create solidarity. And I think this is this passage to online to offline that is, for me, it's more interesting than what is happening online.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you say, of bridging these two dimensions. And we did see with COVID, for example, that's really when a lot of civil society organizations were forced to go online. I mean, all of a sudden we couldn't meet face to face anymore, and actually we even at FARS had to develop some solidarity protocols to literally support members with the hardware, with the computers, because even before COVID hit, I mean, not everybody, digitalization was not really this buzzword, but then because of this emergency situation, things sort of shifted, and now they took, it's a monster of its own. But absolutely, as you say, the fact of bridging this digital world with then the importance of seeing each other in international and global solidarity, it's crucial. And also of decolonizing these spaces, of making, these horizontal spaces of peer exchange, of sharing knowledge, sharing visions, sharing opportunities. And of course, when it comes to digitalization, people might be at very different phases of their digitalization journey. Some organizations might be pros, they might be coding their own programs and their own softwares to serve their communities, but others might barely be using internet connectivity because maybe the village or the country where they are doesn't even have the infrastructures. So this is the challenge and the opportunity. It's a challenge because everybody has to adapt to each other's rhythm of conversation, to each other's knowledge, but it's also an opportunity because it means that if we do create these inclusive and collective spaces to talk about it, then definitely we can learn a lot from each other.
Thank you, Kahina and Bibi. It was a really wonderful conversation. Really appreciate all of your insight and sharing this really useful context.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, super nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. You'll hear more episodes of Europe Talks Back on all streaming platforms, wherever you get your podcast content. Feel free also to like, comment, and subscribe to this YouTube channel.